2 nights ago, when we finished the presentation, a woman came up to me at the reception afterwards, and she was saying, well, on the 3 nights we've covered the 3 triad. So she says, what are you going to do the 4th night? I told her, there'll be a test. I thought I was just being cute, but I did notice she wasn't there last night. She's not here this morning. I probably owe her a tape. So, what we're looking at now is one of the great differences between the Jewish and the Christian dispensation is that the Jewish dispensation, reform came about through conduct. And so what God did with the Jews, if you watch from the beginning of Genesis right through the thing, God consistently gave them laws. And that's why by the time Jesus came, the laws were interminable. There were just laws everywhere. But every time the Jews sort of went astray or something, God would give a new law. And the purpose of the law always was to bring about the reform of the Jews. And so what we see in these 3 points is a way to constantly bring about the reform of the Jews through fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. And God did that with regards to their reform. But depending on your point of view, it's either a plus or a minus. But one of the qualities of this kind of morality is it makes it very easy to judge people. We know exactly what the law is. You can look at me and see if I'm keeping it. It's pure and simple. Makes it very easy to judge people. Once we come into the Christian dispensation, it is very, very different. You and I are supposed to be formed and reformed by principles. And if you've never thought about this before, if you study the composition of the Jewish scriptures, the composition of the Jewish scriptures just slightly overlaps the composition of the Christian scriptures. And so the Jewish scriptures were being composed right up to the very days of Jesus. And why is that? Is because reform was brought about by laws. So you need to constantly be bringing about laws if you're going to bring about reform. But isn't it interesting that within 200 years of the death of Jesus, revelation had stopped? It was all over. We've never had any more revelation since then. And the reason is that in our tradition, reform is brought about by principles. And so if I want to go reform my life, I don't need a new law. I just need to return to the basic principles. And constantly what we do is call ourselves back. But we don't need anything new. You and I just need to do what we already have. That's all we have to do. Well, what I'd like you to understand is that while God was giving these 3 things to the Jews and constantly informing them, he was actually preparing them for the 3 basic principles on which the Christian community is built. And it's the 3 theological virtues, which is faith, hope, and charity. God was trying to build through laws an understanding of what faith, hope, and charity were. And so I'd like to look a little bit about this. The first thing to know about theological virtues, what separates theological virtues from everything else, is that they are, by definition, aimed at God. So, like your belief is not in what God says. But remember we talked earlier about the real depth of belief is just a belief placed in God. Not in the fact he exists, not in what he says, but just a deep, deep faith in God. Okay? And that's theological faith. And as a result of that, you and I believe everything we think he said. And if you've ever studied the differences between denominations, if you were to go to a Jehovah's Witness, a Baptist, a Presbyterian, and a Catholic, the only thing that separates us is what we think he said. But what unites us is, once we know he said it, we all believe it. It's just we understand him to have said different things. But the deep faith is our faith is in God, not in all these little things. We try and follow these because we believe that's what God said. But our faith really rests in God, not in any one of these things. And the same thing, hope. Hope does not rest in what God might do or how he might do it or someone describes heaven or anything. Our hope rests in God. The fact that my entire is in the hands of God. Not what he's going to do with it, what he has done with it, or anything. It must rest just in God. And the same thing about love. Love must be pointed, first of all, at God. I love everybody best if I love God first. Okay? And so that's basically the understanding of theological virtues. So the call to prayer, or the demand that the Jews be involved in prayer, was really supposed to expand them to a deep and powerful faith. So the Jews, over a period of their history, they're constantly commanded to be in a dialogue, an ongoing dialogue with this God. And they were commanded to pray. And I think you know that if you were to look at any religion in the ancient world, the pagan religions, they were all involved in prayers and all kinds of things. But what God wanted the Jews to understand was that when they entered into prayer with regards to God, things happened. It wasn't just a nothing. And I think one of the most amazing things as a believer is not actually what God does as a result of prayers, but what actually happens to us in a state of prayer. Sometimes you have a horrible problem, and you pray to God about delivering the problem, and the problem may or may not end. But it's really interesting how much easier it is to deal with the problem because of the state of prayer. And what God knew was if the Jews were faithful to prayer, they would eventually discover there actually was someone out there they were praying to. There actually was someone. And that's what happened to the Jews. And over a period of their history, of the thousands of years of prayer, both as a people and as individuals, they came to this deep and powerful faith, the faith that you and I know as the gift of faith. They also came to understand that this is, in fact, a gift. It isn't something that comes naturally. And I think one of the curious things, we believe in our tradition, faith is offered to everyone and constantly. One of the things you discover in the Bible is God does not accept no as an answer. If you say yes, he's got you. But if you say no, he interprets it as come back later. Okay? So God will endlessly, offer faith. We believe that no matter who a person is, as long as they walk the face of the earth, they are not beyond saying yes to faith. But a yes must be said to faith. It must actually be received. But it is a gift that God holds out to anyone. Absolutely anyone and everyone. One of the things that this faith brought to the people and is supposed to bring to us is a confidence in the face of the incomprehensible. I think one of my favorite memories of the seminary is a professor one time who had given the class an explanation of something. I even forget what the explanation was about. But when he got all finished, he looked around the class, and like most college professors, he was probably looking at a bored class half asleep. And so he looked around at the class, and he announced to the class, he said, "If you are not terrified, you have not understood what I'm saying." And then he went on with it. Again, I don't remember really what he was talking about, but I do remember that idea of if you don't understand. Because I think one of the major things of human life is the incomprehensibility of it. We see that, in fact, like Japan, just to give you one thing that occurred to me, and I don't know if people ever think of things the way I do, but when this disaster occurred in Japan, I was thinking how different everything would have been if that had occurred in the Second World War. If that same event had occurred during the Second World War, how different all of history would have been. Would it change history completely? Why didn't it? And so I look at all kinds of things in the world, and things in the world, things in history, things in our lives are flat out incomprehensible. They are flat out incomprehensible. And I think that's one of the signs of maturity. The more mature you are, the more incomprehensible you'll believe life is. And the fact of the matter is, faith gives us an assurance in the face and confidence in that kind of incomprehensibility. That we stand facing it because of a God, not because we could ever understand it. One of the things I really like about the Annunciation today is that when God explains the Annunciation to Mary, she still doesn't know what he's talking about. So she just says, whatever you said, amen, I'll go for it, okay? But she has no comprehension. And I believe if God were to sit down and explain to me any of the questions I have, when it got all finished, I still wouldn't know what he was talking about. And it's because it is beyond my understanding. Not just that I don't know, but I think what God is about is flat out beyond understanding. Another thing it brought to the Jews and should bring to us is an assurance of guidance. The fact that there is a God there, a God who really wants to help us, and a God who is available to us. We are involved with this God all the time, and that somehow his involvement is salvific and basically building of life. Another thing the Jews came to from it is what is called a community of faith. The interesting thing, if I were to go to the, let's say the apostolic community, let's just take the apostles. If I were to look at one extreme of the apostles, and I will call it the conservative extreme. The conservative extreme was Simon the Zealot. He was really committed to the Jewish laws, and he was a terrorist. And it was his job to kill Romans. That's what he did. That's what the Zealots did. He was an absolute conservative to the Jewish law. If I were to go to the total liberal, I would be looking at Matthew. Matthew had found a way to accommodate with the Romans so that he collected taxes for their temples and was able to still kind of live as a semi-Jew. And so he sort of had this compromise. And if you study the background of what we know of the few apostles we know anything about, you discover that they are so different. They had nothing in common. Well, not exactly nothing. They had only one thing in common, which was Jesus. And that turned out to be enough. It was the only thing they had in common. And it bound them so solidly that billions of people through history have followed that teaching. And that's all they held in common. And we as Christians and the Jewish community understand that what we hold in common is faith. Our faith being Jesus-orientated, their faith being God-orientated. But basically, what we hold in common is this faith. And it is the only thing that binds us. When I was at the University of Ottawa, one of the things that's interesting, it was an international university. And right when I was at Ottawa, the most conservative theologians in the world were in Rome. And the most liberal theologians in the world at that time were in Holland and were German. In Germany or Holland. And when we went to our classes, we had classes by theologians from Rome and classes by theologians from Holland and Germany. We had classes from theologians from everywhere in the world. And you could not possibly imagine a further distance between some of the theologians we had. We would look at the two extremes in our university and we would say no Protestant and no other religion is further away from us than these two people are from one another, you know? And the fact of the matter is, we as a community can afford to be very, very different, because what holds us together is not our opinions. What holds us together is that deep, powerful faith. It is really what binds us. We can afford to talk about opinions, we can afford to have different positions on all kinds of things, because that is not what holds us together. If you ever see a community where everyone, believes exactly the same thing and you have to do this, and even find communities that dress the same, this sort of thing, that's an indication of a community that really has nothing to bind it. If it had something to bind it, you wouldn't need all these things. Well, what really binds us is this deep, deep, powerful gift of faith. And the other thing that this deep faith gives us is a great freedom in the presence of God. I talked about all these different opinions. Well, all these different opinions don't need to divide us. And these different opinions don't need to divide us from God. Because my relationship to God, again, is tied to this deep faith. Not to my opinion or positions or devotions or anything. It is to this deep faith. And in all the centuries of prayer, God was aiming through conduct to bring the Jews to the principle of faith. And then the faith carries on today. Fasting was really tied to the concept of hope. One of the things you learn if you ever study much about, let's say, dogs. I'm sure this is true of all animals, but anyway, I've studied it with regards to dogs. If you have a dog that, when you put out any kind of food, eats all of it all the time, and will constantly, you have to limit the amount of food and everything you give the dog. Do you know what that indicates in a dog? It indicates that at one time in its life it was hungry. At like if as a puppy he had trouble getting milk, or if, as a young dog there were times when he had to compete with other dogs for food. Once that happens, that dog for the rest of his life will consume everything possible at any possible moment until finally he explodes. Okay? That's exactly the way he'll go about it. If you have a dog that has never ever been hungry, that dog will eat what it wants to eat and leave it. If it gets hungry later, it may come back. But there's just, no great thing of this. And this is kind of the idea with regards to hope. You and I stand in a relationship of hope to the God who controls the future. That's what hope is. Our God absolutely controls the future. You and I need to live in the present. We need to be about the present. But we don't need to sacrifice our present in the favor of a future. Our future is assured. Our future stands in the hands of God. And so through the fasting, he tried to teach them of this concept of it's always there. It's always there. It'll be there tomorrow. The idea that you and I can afford to give up these kinds of things. What he wanted to communicate to them was sort of the gift of final victory. And to understand what this final victory is, I've been listening to a set of tapes that are very interesting. It's a set of tapes on the Battle of Gettysburg. And the tapes it's a tape of a book. I don't read books, I listen to them on tape. But anyway, the particular book is written entirely from the diaries and the letters of the generals involved. And each section of it deals with a specific general. And they break it up so what you see in the background is the battle going on while you're watching all this stuff of not just necessarily the generals, but the people in charge of the battle, how they did it. And one of the things that's most interesting is to watch, let's say, a commander who knows very well that this assault will not work. And he knows very well that this assault is not going to take over the ridge they're going for. So what he needs to do is make a real honest assault and lose as few people as possible. And why is he doing this? Because it's part of a diversion for another thing that is actually going to attack when the enforcements move over against where he's attacking. And this idea that the immediate victory is not the significant thing. That, it's kind of like, we aren't interested in winning the battles, we want the war. And you watch this thing play out. Well, one of the things that you and I are supposed to do is have a sense of that in human life. That is what hope is about. Hope is the idea of final victory. And I think one of the things about being a human being is that you and I oftentimes have a sense of giving up many things in terms of final victory. I think people who go through for a high education, let's say to be a doctor, a lawyer, physicist, scientist, or something, you give up a lot of time of vacations and everything in the knowledge that one day you'll have both the time and the money to do that. But you give it up in this idea of hope. And I don't think you really have much a sense of giving it up. What you play in your mind is what's coming up. And so this is what you and I are supposed to find in hope, this gift of final victory. The second thing we're supposed to find in hope is this sense that you and I will be provided whatever is necessary. Okay? And I think in terms of this, with the Pauline concept, do you remember that Paul talks about a thorn in his side, And we have no idea really what he's talking about there. I think I've told you this before, but if you ever listen to a preacher talk about it, and he explains to you what the thorn in Paul's side actually was, we in the seminary, we used to love to hear someone comment on that, because people will inevitably presume it's their problem. So if anyone, like if I were to get up and talk to you about alcoholism being the thorn in Paul's side, trust me, I'm an alcoholic, okay? That anytime someone talked about it, so I never talk about it. But anyway, this idea that when Paul turns to God, you remember what God says to him? My grace is sufficient. He says, my grace is sufficient for you. And the fact is, the grace, air, education, the people I need, whatever, everything necessary to my salvation has been, is being, and will be provided. That's hope. Whatever is necessary. And I think sometimes you and I perceive what is necessary. More often than not, we don't. And I think one of the great things of human life is to be able to look back at things that have gone on in your life and realize how catastrophically necessary some person, place, or thing was, and you knew nothing while it was going on. Like I mentioned with the Annunciation, you know, the entire universe shifted on its axis, and there wasn't a single person on the face of the earth who knew it. Even Mary didn't fully understand it. Not a single person. And all of history changed. Everything changed at that moment. Another thing is to understand that you and I, in this thing of hope, live in a constant expectation of the presence of God. And to understand what it is in the presence of God, our hope is not a God who sits, you know, out there waiting for us. Our hope is in a God who's beside us. An example would be like when I go into the hospital for the cancer surgeries. When I go into the hospital for the surgery, I do not imagine a Jesus who is the surgeon in the emergency room and the operating room. I do not imagine a Jesus who walks beside me into the hospital. I do not imagine a Jesus who's pushing my gurney. I imagine a Jesus who's on the gurney beside me. That is the presence of Jesus in each of our lives. That Jesus chooses to expand and to relive his humanity in each one of us. And so that's why in the Catholic Church, you know, on Easter Vigil, we celebrate baptisms. We celebrate baptisms because it is our teaching that any time a person is baptized and rises out of those waters, Jesus Christ rises from the dead again. And why does he rise from the dead again? To live in that person forever. That's what baptism is. And so this idea of the ongoing, complete presence of Jesus, it's kind of amazing when you think that God taught that through fasting. But that's what he presented to the Jewish people. And the final thing is almsgiving, which was to teach us to understand the love of God. One of the really funny things about people, you find this with teenagers principally, but they think they can acquire someone as a friend or a lover by doing things for them. So if there's someone they really like, you know, they give little presents to and all this sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is, if I do something for some person, they may never notice. They may even dislike it. But the fact of the matter is, each time I do something, I will fall deeper in love with them. And that's the nature of caring. If you've ever read The Little Prince, that what you care for, you'll end up loving. And that's what God wanted us to do. God wanted us, by obliging us to give alms, he wanted us to care for one another so that we'd fall in love with one another. Because the day you fall completely in love is the day you understand how God is involved with you. Your love for any person around you is a sacrament of how much God loves you. And I should say, a faint sacrament. Anyone who loves you and does anything for you, and is any way involved with you, is a faint sacrament of God's love of you. And the idea of being able to read this as this is something very, very significant, not a minor thing on the face of the earth. And again, I just kind of like to give you an example from, I'll use the dog again. One time when I was walking Shiloh, the first dog I had here, one of the things he used to do was when he saw food, like for instance he'd go through the patio periodically and find an abandoned donut, he would go over to it and he would not touch it. He would stand at it and look at it. And if I said okay, he ate it. If I said come, he would come. And so like if we're going through the park and he goes over and looks, I look, and is it, you know, a piece of bread or something? I say okay. And if it's a chicken bone, I say come, and he comes. But one day we're going through the park, and he goes over there, and I go over and I see it is an entire piece of Colonel Sanders' chicken. I say come. He does not move. This is not just a chicken bone, honey. And so I say come. I say it 3 times. Nothing happens. So I walk over and I say, you come. Nothing happens. So I decide I'm going to at least get it out of the way. I make a move for it. He's got it. It's down. You know? And so one of the things, I don't hit dogs, so I just, you know, sort of came to my senses, and then we would go on. So we went on with the walk. 2 days later, he had to go out to go to the bathroom. I went out, and I hear this horrible noise from the dog. And I go out, and he's bleeding from his mouth and his rear end. Blood is pouring out. So I take him to the vet, and the vet tells me how much it's going to cost to remove these chicken bones from his intestine because they found them on the x-ray. It is a rather large amount of money, and I'm thinking to myself, he saw it. I told him not to. I was very clear about not to. He deserves the result of what he's done. Of course, I'm thinking this while I'm signing the check, and put down the check, so, you know, and they take care of it when they get out. But one of the most wonderful things that happened to me is that when I came back, the next morning, we had a gospel account dealing with one of the forgiveness stories of Jesus. And the thing that really occurred to me is you cannot imagine that you are more forgiving than Jesus. And you stood there, you watched him, you told him, you informed him, and you still couldn't see him go through what he absolutely deserved from what he'd done. And you think that God would allow you to go through the result of your own sins? That's to say that you actually love a dog more than God loves you. That is absurd. You and I need to learn to understand the love we have for others is the sign and sacrament of God's love for us. Intensity, power, everything. And the love people have for us is a sign of God's love for us. What God was doing with these 3 things for the Jews was trying to create the knowledge of these principles. In Jesus, these principles of faith, hope, and charity were powerfully taught, and they were enunciated and put together in the writings of Paul, where he talks about all the different virtues, but when everything's gone, you end up with faith, hope, and charity. And for our entire history, when you and I want to be reformed, we only need to look in our lives at 3 things: faith, hope, and love. And our reformation will always be calling ourselves back to these in one way or another. Thank you very much.